Sometimes the pride we take in things creates an insatiable desire to improve just that little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. Sometimes the vision we have extends beyond our talents, and we find false hope and fake help, trying to turn an idea into something grander than it has to be. All when, sometimes, it's better as a shit show. So, as one flawed human to another, with all my love, Refrigerate After Publishing presents the Saturday Morning Shit Show. Well, here we are. And since 2 is not 1, I'll assume I've got your attention. And I won't waste it. On to Chapter 2. Come what may. The world surrounding him was eerily familiar while at the same time being entirely alien. Dr. Holland suddenly found himself alone and dressed in his finest suit. Though he seemed to go completely unnoticed, the world around him was bustling. From where he stood, he was able to see buildings taller than even his money-minded father could have imagined. Yet, not constructed from steel, at least not entirely. The buildings themselves had crumbled, perhaps even long ago, but nature had returned to stabilize what man once created. Great trees reached from the ground as if sharing roots with the skyscrapers themselves. As they climbed together, the arbor twisted in ways that should have been impossible, strengthening the skyscraper's structural integrity. The doctor stared up, through the gaps in thick clouds which seemed to hang lower than he could remember. It took his mind a moment to catch up before he was able to actually see. The trees had even perfectly covered massive holes in the sides of the buildings. Turning his attention now back to ground level, Paul took in the crowd. Everyone busy and no one in a hurry. More than he could ever have hoped to see in his lifetime, he glimpsed in this dreamscape a harmony not only within man, but between man and nature. As he watched, people of every race and color, even some that hardly seemed human at all, happily worked together to tend their forest of ruins. Suddenly, and almost silently, a gleaming rail running down the center of the overgrown street began to glow a light blue. From within the forested buildings, a tram car was gliding seamlessly into view. Slowly it moved in Paul's direction, floating nearly 6 inches above its rail, apparently without any suspension. His eyes followed it as the tram rode past him, smoother than anything he had ever seen, till it was out of sight, enveloped by the trees that braced its practiced route. Given there was so much to take in, it should serve as no surprise that Paul only just now began to see the absolute abundance of strange little creatures. They were everywhere, acting as contented ambassadors between mankind and the beauty of the natural world. In the very flowers at his feet, he saw a universe of insects unknown to him. A snake slithered through the flowers, paying Dr. Holland no mind. Yet, even the snake was like nothing he could possibly imagine. It was covered in a short, spiky fur that was striped like the thorax of a bee and equally covered in pollen. As he watched, the snake did its part to pollinate the city with immense efficiency. Soon, it was far enough away that he couldn't see its progress through the tall grass. His gaze then went to a small flock of large, colorful birds, fluttering playfully near a thick patch of trees. Compelled, Paul walked towards them. It was unclear if the creatures had seen him, but as he got closer, he was able to tell that they weren't birds, per se. They were small, 6-legged foxes, each carried by 2 sets of huge butterfly wings. As if they had been waiting for a cue, the flock of foxes each went their separate ways all at once. Dr. Holland didn't lose a step. He didn't know if he could stop. He followed one of the fox's aerial acrobatics into the thicket. The light level dimmed quickly as if night had fallen, but he could still see the orange fur flitting about the trees. Paul kept following it until he nearly tripped. When he looked down to catch his footing, he lost sight of the creature. Realizing he had no idea which way he had come from, Paul accepted that he was lost. There was no panic, No worry. He knew, dream or not, lost or found, that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. A light, faint and pulsing gently, wrapped itself around the sides of a tree several feet in front of Paul. Stepping to the side of the tree, he was unsurprised to see a woman standing some distance behind it. Dr. Harlan had never seen her before in his life, nor felt a weight even resembling the one he felt in her presence. Yet there was nothing malicious to the weight. It was comforting, motherly even. Still, under that surface there was a vengeful rage that promised to emerge given provocation. Though the increasing glow that came from her made it even more difficult, she was near indescribable regardless. Her hair was spring, floral and windswept. Her face was summer, harsh yet friendly. Her dress was autumn, its textures vivid and train one with the forest floor. And her stride was winter, for nothing could stop her approach. There wasn't much distance between the woman and Paul, and she closed it. He caught sight of a bundle in one of her arms. The bundle squirmed and cooed in a manner that had become assuring to Paul. Suddenly an arm shot up from the bundle. George's arm. The shine emanating from the woman abated significantly with each step she took towards Dr. Harlan until, finally, they were face to face, if only for a second. She reached out with her free arm and placed it gently on his shoulder.
"Thank you, Paul."
Dr. Harlan awoke all at once, rested but completely free of the fog of sleep. George was already softly cooing to indicate his wakefulness. Paul saw that the little one had somehow managed to pull an arm free from the blanket, exposing most of his side. After bundling George back up, Paul pulled up the blinds and took a moment to think about their next move. Sunset had nearly concluded, and it was silent aside from the train upon the track. Until it wasn't.
"They're in this one."
A familiar voice came from outside of Paul's compartment door. The response was a thickly accented growl that couldn't be made out in its entirety.
"Because I saw their number when I kicked his bag."
The second man, his voice maybe an octave higher than the first, spoke up.
"We're professionals, Orange. Cut us some fucking slack."
Paul still couldn't hear what he was saying over the rumble of the train and through the door separating them. Suddenly, George began to squall from his drawer, and judging by a rising stench, Paul knew exactly what the ruckus was about.
"Quiet,"
demanded the second male. Not only did the conversation outside of their compartment stop, both Paul and George fell deathly still. Dr. Harlan's eyes nearly bulging out of his head as he stared at the door, waiting for an ambush. George fixated on the ceiling with a similar intensity, though what he was waiting for was anyone's guess. After what felt like forever, listening as closely as he could, Paul heard a series of footsteps heading away from the compartment. He looked instinctually down at his watch, wondering how much time he had just sat with bated breath. His father had given him the flashy gold timepiece when he came home from boarding school. His attention was glued to it for nearly a minute before he realized he had no idea what time he started hearing the voices outside. Only that it was 7:10 now. Snapping out of it, Dr. Harlan picked George up out of his drawer and closed it. Changing diapers was becoming a more regular part of Paul's life than he would have anticipated. However, even if he had been ready for fatherhood, George's half-avian excrement defined a new level of horrific smells for the young doctor. In the time it took to get the fledgling child into a clean diaper, Paul had decided what to do. Bundling George into a blanket, Dr. Harlan settled him back into his arm before grabbing their luggage and slowly opening the door. As it slid open and no one attacked, he cautiously peered out. The only person in the hall connecting the compartments was a mountain of a man, clad in a gray suit, his back to the front of the train. He saw the two of them as soon as they entered the hallway. "Excuse me, Mr. Harlan." When the man spoke, it was nearly a growl. As Paul looked at him, he sneered and tipped his hat, an orange-banded fedora. He was definitely one of the voices from outside their compartment minutes ago. Figuring out that there was even less time than he thought, Dr. Harlan ran. Suddenly, without a plan, he was headed towards the back of the train as fast as he could manage while still holding on to George and the luggage as well as possible. Even over the rumble of the train, it was nothing to be able to hear the large man's footfalls in pursuit. The chase continued through several train cars exactly like car 21 before the man with the orange hat said anything else. "Mr. Harlan, I don't think you understand what you're doing." Paul ignored him. He was starting to feel his lungs burn and arms strain with the effort. Cursing a lack of exercise routine, he dug deep for another burst of energy as they crashed into a crowded dining car. Dr. Harlan considered for a second trying to knock over a table with his luggage, but decided against the gamble. An older woman, either from dramatics or shock, knocked her plate down, shattering it on the floor. "This is an outrage!" she shouted as Paul and George barreled past. Mr. Orange had been keeping a steady pace, but now that there was an audience, he sped up. He called out as they exited one dining car and entered another. "Stop that man." Immediately, 3 men near the center of the car tried to catch Paul, only to have him slip through their fingers without even slowing him down.
"He stole that baby! Get him!"
The man closest to the fleeing doctor yelled, and probably correctly, filling in the holes of the story. The 3 men then clogged the door Dr. Harlan had just ran through, causing the big lug's plan to backfire incredibly. Paul glanced over his shoulder as he sprinted through a nearly empty lounge car. The door behind him swung closed and he could see Orange, a flash of color taller than the writhing clog in the doorway, forcing the men out of his way, though they didn't seem so inclined to continue helping once he finished pushing his way through. Pleased to have gained some distance, Dr. Harlan quickly made his way through the next door, nearly slamming George and himself into a stack of crates in one of the storage cars. Navigation through the next few cars would be far less straightforward. Progress through the train slowed but didn't stop. While he was braced between a pair of steamer trunks, the idea came to him that he could hide, hope their pursuer just goes past. Instead, he pressed on. By the time Paul got them to the door of the last storage car, he could hear the door at the other end of the car open. He couldn't take the time to contemplate how the big guy caught up so fast. He had to get that distance back. Taking a deep breath and making sure he had a good grip on George and their luggage, Paul started to run again. Pushing the door open, he was surprised to see that the next car had no door. Within a moment or two, Dr. Harlan realized that he had just gotten into the cheap seats near the back of the train. There were people spread about the car, and no one did anything more than follow him with their eyes or gasp as he ran through and into the next passenger car. Paul could see that the next actual door was a few cars ahead, leaving him effectively running out in the open. Hearing the rising calamity behind him, Paul rushed for that last door. Bursting through the door, he was unsurprised to find himself in the first of 2 sleeping cars for the train's employees. Elated, he saw open air through the doorless exit of the caboose. Without even bothering to catch his breath, Dr. Harlan bolted through the next 2 cars, stirring the occasional employee from slumber. Before he knew it, Paul was in the caboose, small kitchen and food storage on either side of him. Still in motion, he turned to look over his shoulder one last time and thought he could see Mr. Orange clearing the final passenger car through the window in the last door. Suddenly, the train began to decelerate, gradually but enough to notice. Paul found himself stumbling as he exited the back of the moving train. Terrified that this misstep was going to kill them both, he pivoted hard to the side, turning all the way around. Uncertainty stretched the moment beyond belief. But eventually, Dr. Harlan's lower back made contact with the rail running along the sides of the caboose's end. There was a sickening crack. Paul screamed in pain. He could feel the luggage fly from his hand, could see it land back inside the train car. Instinctively, he brought his now freed hand up to further brace George in the crook of his arm, whimpering in a way a grown man rarely does. Paul slumped down onto his butt, put his back against the rail that wrecked him. Dr. Holland wasn't sure how well he could move. Not at the moment. Rather than try to stand back up, he held tightly onto his son and looked to the opening beside him. He shuddered at how close they had come to being a stain on the tracks. Paul hadn't heard the door on the other end of the sleeper cars open while he was busy crippling himself. It wasn't hard to hear the frustrated footfalls of Mr. Orange, though. It was much harder to accept that it was just over. Like that. Grunting from the movement, Paul leaned his head down and lifted his arms to kiss George on the forehead. Maybe they would be kind to him. I love you, kid. Dr. Holland pressed his lips tightly to the child's head, breathing in the boy's scent, fearing he might never have the opportunity again. The crashing footsteps were louder now. He was in the caboose. Paul was sure of it. "Fuck!" shouted the valet in a panic. Dr. Holland looked up just in time to see Mr. Orange, having tripped over their luggage, soar off the back of the train. "Oh no!" Panic became terror and was cut viscerally short when the valet's neck snapped and met the ground. Paul was grateful that he wasn't able to turn and see the impact. The train was slowing down, but it would still be quite a while before they came to a stop, although, even unseen, Dr. Holland's imagination borrowed his medical knowledge and tossed up an image of the valet, prostrate across the tracks, cracked skull exposed, his face a skid on the rails, hat carried off by a stiff breeze, its bright orange band flecked with crimson. "The other two are going to notice he's gone," Paul told George. "How long do you think we have to just sit here?" He pulled the blanket off of George's face. "Have you been asleep this whole time?" There was no way to tell for sure, but he was waking up again now. George looked up at Paul with admiration before he began babbling in his own chirpy way. Dr. Holland leaned his head back and smiled in spite of the sudden brutal accident. There was still time. It wasn't over yet. They were far from out of the woods, though. He knew that. Sliding over a bit, Paul was able to peer into the length of the train. He was certain that if they waited too long, one of the valet's compatriots, or even a real employee waking from the nearby sleeper car, would find them. Acutely aware of the train's decreasing speed and fully expecting a shift change in the employees when they reached the next station, the doctor swallowed hard. They had waited as long as he would dare, wagering a slower impact against being discovered. Dr. Holland took a deep breath, moved to the gap in the rail without getting up, and curled tightly around George. Then he leaned back, and the moving train gave way to blackness and agony. Even as his breath was taken from him and he lost consciousness, Paul stayed curled around the infant, who had begun to wail. Just as many baby birds are, George found himself helpless. The only positive to be said about his situation was that Dr. Holland's body kept him warm in the late evening chill. As an infant, George had no concept of life and death. He could hardly comprehend a change in his own conscious state, let alone someone else's. Braced against the doctor, he sat on the train tracks and cried. Cries that were muffled by the man protecting him. Yet there was no descendant angel to come and save the day, whisking the child off to safety. His only hope lay curled around him with a broken back. Time continued to pass. The babe had screamed himself hoarse and now only shook pathetically, hardly able to manage a tear anymore. Not hungry or dirty, but scared, confused, and alone. Without the strength to climb free of his current entrapment, George was left with no choice other than to wait for the next train to come through. Though the child couldn't wrap its head around the idea and danger of an incoming locomotive. This made no difference to the tons of metal, now beginning to faintly vibrate the rails on either side of them. Suddenly, with a violent gasp, Dr. Holland's eyes flashed to life. Before doing anything else, he rolled George and himself a safe distance from the tracks. Distracted by searing pain in his spine, Paul was unable to see the ditch. They fell a short distance, the angle of his roll just barely allowing him to land on his feet, the water quickly soaking through the leather of his shoes. Propping his back up against the steep embankment was almost comfortable. Grimacing through the pain of landing, Dr. Harlan lifted George to his chest. Holding him tightly, he ran a hand through the soft down atop his head. It's okay, George. Everything is okay now. Paul soothed his distraught son as the train started passing by. Its passage was near deafening and shook even the ditch they were in. Dr. Harlan knew it would take a few minutes for the entirety of the train to pass and decided the best thing for them to do would be to just wait. Besides, he wasn't going to find better support for his back anytime soon, even if it meant wet feet. He checked his watch, 1 in the morning, and then went back to stroking the sobbing boy's head. After leaning his head back against the cool grass, Paul tried not to focus on how long he had been out. It was better just to be thankful he and George were alive. The doctor steadied his hold on the infant, going so far as to anchor his hand between 2 buttons on his disheveled shirt. George's sobs slowly softened, and hours of screaming translated quite easily into a nap. Paul didn't notice him fall asleep. He found himself entranced by starlight and the vibrations of the passing train. Before he knew it, the stars seemed to grow dim. This was only his eyes closing. In that moment, safe but tormented by his recent injuries, Dr. Harlan's body chose to value what comfort he found propped in the ditch like a drink before trekking the Sahara. 2 of them slept. Light as the avian infant was, after a few hours locked in an almost upright position, even Paul's arm had begun to ache. This pain was a whisper when compared to his broken back, though. To top it off, his long-soaked feet had become sore and disgusting. Yet when the sun began to peek out from the horizon, waking the pair of them, Dr. Harlan was grateful for the morning. Good morning, George. Paul greeted his boy along with a new day. Bleary-eyed, the child took in his surroundings as well as he could. Drunk with sleep and objecting to the morning sun, George closed his eyes again. The doctor was relieved. He didn't have their luggage, and this meant they had no diapers or food left, so the longer the kid stayed asleep, the better. Bundling George tighter in his dusty blanket, he transferred him to the other arm, shaking his cradle arm back to life. It was then, when he turned his attention to the task, that Paul made a grim realization. He couldn't get out of the ditch. Any core movement the doctor would make was met with a pain he couldn't have fathomed 24 hours ago. While he still had the use of his extremities, he couldn't make sense of balance. Dr. Harlan felt much like a crumbling tower. Then his mind's eye took him back to the broken skyscrapers of his dream, braced impossibly by nature and surrounded by beautiful, bustling ruin. As he looked down at the sleeping child in his arms, Paul's resolve began to return. Dr. Harlan slowly started stepping to his left, hoping that the ditch's bank would become less steep down the line. Progress was agony, waterlogged shoes sloshing through the bottom of the ditch. Still, the doctor was careful not to cry out, stifling himself with grunts and occasionally going as far as to bite the side of his free hand. George slept somewhat fitfully while Paul gradually slid them along the ditch. Praising their luck, Paul noticed the ditch feeling less steep at the same time he started to see it getting shallower. He braced his free hand against the bank on his back and pushed himself to a near upright position. Unfortunately, they were still nearly up to Paul's chest in a soggy trench. Dr. Harlan rested George on a dry patch of grass. Cracks and pops coming from his back made the doctor cringe, fearing he was going to fall apart. After placing his elbows near where George whimpered with burgeoning wakefulness, Paul dug his shoes into the bank. It wasn't possible for him to mute his agonized scream, inching his way back onto level ground. Not a moment after Dr. Holland gave voice to his pain, George's bird-like wail chorused him. Nearly out of the ditch, and knowing he wouldn't be able to get up off the ground or pick George up while standing, Paul scooped his son into his arms. Momentum was calling the shots now, his back not allowing him the luxury of slowing down. Somehow he managed to stumble across the train tracks without tripping himself. Then, like a gift from above, he caught sight of a long wooden fence running perpendicular to his path in either direction. It may have been too late, however. Just feet from the fence, Dr. Holland completed his long fall. The next part he owed solely to instinct, his free hand launching forward. Surprisingly, Paul did not come crashing down, crushing George and further immobilizing himself. He had managed to catch himself on the lower rung of the fence, face now only about a foot from the ground. Paul's arms strained, barely holding them aloft. Fed up, his back buckled, and he yelped in pain before getting his legs under him and finding some purchase on his knees. George was safe and still wailing, at least as well as he could after the previous day's hoarseness and today's lack of sustenance. It was no easy task, but Dr. Holland used his knees, free arm, and the fence to leverage himself to his feet. Previously occupied, he only now noticed how much higher the sun had risen. A painful journey through a mundane ditch having robbed him of his sense of time. Despite it all, his watch still gleamed, unbothered by its wearer's struggle, and ticked along. Paul read it as being nearly 9 in the morning, but soon found himself wondering what that mattered. His old routine was long gone now. Looking down past his timepiece, Dr. Holland noticed that his ditch-soaked shoes had popped most of their stitching. The leather had begun to bloom like a dumpster flower. Believing that it was for the best, he kicked what remained of his shoes off. Mobility limited as it was, he was unable to remove his socks, the damp argyle material plastered to his skin. Paul covered George's face loosely and briefly did what he could to soothe the boy. "Don't fret, George. We're going to find food. We'll get cleaned up, and we'll find somewhere safe." George began to quiet a bit, and then considerably more so when he suddenly discovered he could chew on the blanket covering his face. Unable to see any recourse for the time being, Dr. Harlan allowed him this vice and decided to just make sure he didn't choke. Now began a journey more daunting than he could have expected, yet haunting in its simplicity. Paul braced himself on the fence to his left, looking quickly at the landscape he was putting to his back. Some distance away he could see a rail bridge spanning a body of water. Other than that, Dr. Harlan thought he could see the beginnings of construction on a much larger bridge. He faced the other way now, with George nestled in his right arm and his left balanced against the wooden fence. Grinning a little despite the pain, Paul spotted an unmistakable silhouette of a small town, too far away to determine just how small. He started hobbling in that direction, praying the fence could do most of the load bearing. Each step hurt more than the last, but he pressed on, occasionally pulling some of the blanket from George's mouth. It felt like forever until the town seemed any closer at all. The fence had carried him this far, however. Dr. Harlan was grateful for that. He could see a short bridge now, a couple 100 feet away and separating him from the town. The fence wasn't going to take them much further. Paul stood as straight as his failing frame would allow. He let go of the fence. Pain became much more intense then, once again surpassing itself. Refusing to falter after coming so far, he took one shaky step after another. Before too long, pace and pain reached some sort of sick homeostasis. A young father with his adopted infant, shambling towards a bridge like a broken marionette. Finally, they had reached the bridge, and Dr. Harlan was relieved of some of his pain by its guardrail. This would be one of the hardest parts, though. It wasn't much of an incline, but any departure from flat, even rocky, ground was made far more turbulent by recent events. Exerted upon reaching the infrastructure's apex, he took a deep breath. Then, being a man of above-average intelligence, Paul noticed something. Looking down the other side of the bridge, the decline wouldn't actually be any easier. Genuinely afraid of taking more than the briefest of breaks, he kept walking forward, expecting the rail to help him down like it assisted his ascent. He wasn't wrong, but he found it was easier pulling his way up than it was constantly pushing himself upright on the way down. By the time the two of them had made it to the bridge's base on the other side, Dr. Harlan felt like at least one of his vertebrae was going to tumble free into his intestines. There was still a short distance before the town unfolded in earnest. Having had some time to ponder the specifics, Paul decided now would be the best time to change George's diaper. Gradually, he made it down to rest on a knee, a nearby bush obscuring them from the town, but not the road into it. Setting the boy on the ground to wriggle at his leisure, Dr. Harlan glanced around for some other answer. Without their luggage, though, he saw no other option. He untucked what little bit of his shirt remained stuffed into his pants, then he ripped a wide strip from the bottom of his shirt, straining to do so, before finding a hole, likely from his abrupt departure of the moving train. When it gave way, his back crumpled, and with the release of tension, and for a second, he wasn't sure if it was him or his shirt that had torn. Finding himself in a constant low-grade state of shock, Paul grunted through it. No longer willing to regard his watchful perspective, Dr. Harlan unwrapped the blanket and undid the safety pin to George's soiled coverings. "We'll find something to eat soon, I promise." It broke the young doctor's heart to have nothing more than reassurance to offer the child. Now that he was able to take a moment to tend to the boy, cleaning him with the least soiled parts of his old diaper, Paul took notice of a couple things. First was the most obvious. The beak-like protrusion that served at George's mouth had hardened enough to cut through his blanket easily. Any section of the hospital garb he had been chewing on was now littered with little holes. Next was more of a deduction than an observation. The child seemed to have a high threshold for discomfort, perhaps easily injured and understandably bothered by pain. Yet he had put up with an unbelievable amount of hunger and filth, complaining far less than one would expect from an infant. Well, it was a slapdash job, but given the full scope of their situation, Dr. Harlan took a moment to admire his handiwork. The lower half of his ripped shirt served as a good enough crap catcher for little George. There was a momentary peace as Paul bundled George back up into his blanket, careful to hide the holes and offer him a new chunk of fabric to peck at. However, when he leaned down one last time to pick his boy up, the doctor was quickly brought back to reality by his own ricketiness. Still, amount of effort notwithstanding, he made it back to his feet eventually and got the two of them moving again. Although progress into the town was slow, with each step they put more distance between themselves and the shit they left behind.